Good morning, church. We are glad that you are joining us today. Let me give you just a little bit of FYI. We are going to tape the last two devotions, Bible studies for 2 Corinthians. And then we're going to move on after we're through with Corinthians here. And we're going to go into a devotional or a Bible study on Psalms 23. I've recently got a couple of sheep, and I have some new insights to Psalm 23, so I'm looking forward to that study with you. But this morning, we are going to tape the last two, and then we'll post one this Thursday morning, and the last one next Thursday morning. We'll post them at normal time, 9:30 there on Thursday morning. So let's get right into this Bible study, and it's a good Bible study. It's one of those Bible studies that we can use it, and it encourages us in the midst of our difficulty. Let's read these verses. And least I should be exalted above measure by the abundance of revelations. A thorn in the flesh was given to me, Paul says in verse 7 of chapter 12. A messenger of Satan to buffet me, lest I be exalted above measure. Concerning this thing, I pleaded with the Lord 3 times that it might depart from me. And he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my strength is made perfect in weakness. Therefore, most gladly, I would rather boast in my infirmities, that the power of Christ may rest upon me. Therefore, I take pleasure in infirmity, in reproaches, in needs, in persecution, in distress, for Christ's sake. For when I am weak, then I am strong. The last few chapters of this book of 2 Corinthians, Paul's second letter to the church, Paul talked about false leaders. He talked about the attacks on his authority, his character, his ministry, and he talked about the struggles that he faced in serving the Lord. The opening verses of chapter 12 of this letter, Paul refers to a vision that he had, that he was caught up in the third heaven. As far as that vision was concerned, whether it was a dream or actually a vision, or he was physically transported. There's debate about whatever stand you would take. The important thing is that he was with the Lord. He experienced this amazing thing. And then as we walk through that, Paul talks about how wonderful that was. Then he begins to deal in verse 7 about how we are to deal with, how we should face problems in our life. He calls them a thorn in the flesh, a messenger from Satan. That word thorn could also be translated stake, probably referring to some of the punishment that took place on the stake that Paul would have been familiar with of the Roman penal system. But he talked about this thorn in the flesh. There's so many ideas or theories, points of view about what Paul's thorn of the flesh was. There are those who say that it was entirely spiritual, that there was spiritual attack from Satan upon Paul's life. Most scholars, though, would consider that it was a physical thorn in the flesh, that it was actually a physical ailment. We know that Paul suffered from malaria. We know that Paul suffered from a poor eyesight. We know that in one of the churches that he visited, they cared for him for several months before he was back on his feet. And so a lot of Bible scholars, and I tend to agree with this, that Paul was talking about his eyesight. Paul would say to his letters, see with what large letters I write. Most of the time Paul had a scribe, and he was very difficult for him to see. His eyes were bad. And if you can imagine how difficult it would be to minister, how difficult it would be to read the scriptures, how difficult it would be to write, that those things that were so dear to Paul as he ministered to all the churches that he had established, that'd be really difficult. And I can just imagine Paul asking the Lord 3 times to take it away from me. There's also been a speculation about, is that a particular magic number, or what's the deal with verse 8 when he says 3 times? Well, perhaps Paul just simply used Jesus' example when he was in the Garden of Eden, when he prayed 3 times that the cup that he was about to face would be passed from him. And Paul would say, Lord, take this thorn of the flesh from me 3 times. And then Jesus responds to Paul in verse 9. And if you've got a red letter edition Bible, you'll see that these words in verse 9 are in red, indicating that it was Jesus speaking to Paul, not just the Lord. It was the person of Jesus who spoke to Paul when he said, my grace is sufficient for you, and my strength is made perfect in weakness. And so Paul is given that encouraging word from the Lord. My strength, the Lord's strength, is made perfect in your weakness, Paul. Your weakness, I come in and I make you strong. We look at this portion of Scripture and we decide, okay, what battle am I facing? Does it seem like he doesn't hear you? Have you prayed for that situation often? Can you accept the words that was given to Paul, my grace is sufficient for you? Now listen to Paul's testimony in verse 9 and 10. Therefore, most gladly, Paul says, I would rather boast on my infirmities, that the power of Christ rests in me. Therefore, I take pleasure in infirmities, in reproaches, in needs, in persecutions, in distress, for Christ's sake. For when I am weak, then I am strong. Paul says, I take pleasure. It echoes those words of his words from Romans when he talks about being joyful, considerate, a badge of courage, so to speak, when trials come upon you. In James, when James says, consider it pure joy, my brethren, when various trials comes against us. Paul says, I take pleasure in these things, knowing that Christ will work in me in the midst of this. And again, in that beginning of this book of this letter that Paul wrote to the Corinthians in 2 Corinthians 1, Paul says that we struggle through, we suffer through our trials so that we can help someone else who's going through a similar thing. So that's another reason why we take pleasure in our trials. Now, of course, we're not happy that we're sick, or that we're not happy that we have this disease, or we were in this accident, or whatever that. But what the point is God will use those things as we surrender to him. When I am weak, then I am strong because of Jesus Christ. So whatever you're going through today, whatever trial, circumstance that you are struggling with, understand that Jesus is with you and his grace is sufficient for you. And in the midst of all of that, you can become strong in the word of Christ. Keep those things in mind this week as you finish out the week and enter into a new week and face the things that we all face with in our everyday life, some harder than others. But know that whether it's hard or whether it's not all that tough, that Jesus is with you in the midst of those trials. His grace is sufficient for you. God bless you today. We hope to see you Sunday morning. Jim Kingsbury, our missionary to the Muslim world, will be with us. We'll be taking a love offering. So I encourage you. He always brings a wonderful sermon and some great stories. So make it an effort to come to church Sunday morning. God bless you.